I really want to welcome our listeners to this next podcast around Genesis. What we will be discussing today is Noah and the flood, and there's quite a few target points that we would like to address. First of all, the Sumerian hypothesis, and I have Dr. Willie McLeod that's going to go into more detail around that. The dating of the flood, the origin of the flood stories, whether the flood was local or global. We're going to touch on a very interesting character, perhaps just for a short bit, Meshkiach Kasher. And then we're going to look at the mountain of Ararat and its location. So quite a few topics that will be covered. And I've got Pastor Carel Smith and Dr. Willie McLeod to address those questions. So Willie, I actually wanted to start with the question, did the flood actually take place? And what is the archaeological evidence for that?
Yeah, so Labai, it's a pleasure to be with you again on this program. And when it comes to the flood, it's first, let me say, I believe a flood did happen. What is meant by the flood and to what extent the flood covered the world, that's things we will be talking about today. So the first thing to consider is, remember, biblical tradition was first written down in the framework of the Bible by, we believe, by Moses. We've talked about the reasons why we believe Moses wrote down the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11. Now that was about 1400 BC. But clearly the story that's being told in the primeval history is much older than Moses. It goes long before that period and that time. Now what is interesting is this story is not only found in the Bible, it's also found in the Sumerian tradition, it's also found in the Akkadian tradition, and it's also found in the Babylonian tradition. So in all these traditions, all the peoples that lived in that area had a very, very similar tradition, the flood hero. And also in all of their traditions, the flood was regarded not as a local incident, but as something that destroyed mankind. It was a global event. It's not only in the biblical tradition that we find this. So these traditions are clearly very similar. One have other flood traditions all over the world, obviously, but these traditions are very close to each other for the simple reason they come from the very same region, which is Mesopotamia and the countries towards the north in Canaan, where we find the biblical tradition. And I've argued previously on this program that this material, which we find in the primeval history, Genesis chapters 1 to 11, actually goes back to the prehistory of Israel. That's where the people of Israel's forefathers originated. And according to the Bible, they came from the land of Sumer. That was where Abram lived. He lived in Ur. Ur was one of the most important cities of the Sumerian civilization. Abram is slightly after the Sumerian civilization has come to an end, and is slightly before the Babylonians took over control of the whole of Mesopotamia in the time of Hammurabi.
So really, what if you had to put a date? I think in your article that I read, you're referring to 3,400 BC.
Now that's regarding when we talk about the flood.
Okay.
So what I'm now just talking about is where Abram fits into history, and that's about 1,800, 1,850, 1,900. That's about the period that we relate to Abram. So that was more or less the time that he left. So I believe that material was brought from Sumer to Canaan by the Abrahamic family. So it's actually the same tradition. Now, when we go back in Sumerian tradition and archaeologically speaking in the history of ancient Mesopotamia, we find a moment in history where there's actually evidence of such a very large deluge, a large flood. And it's the flood layers that have been found in various cities all over southern Mesopotamia. For example, what best known is probably at Ur, the same city where Abraham originated from.
Yes.
And the flood layer in that town, this particular one I'm talking about, was 3.7 meters, the mud. So it formed a layer. So one can get an idea of 2.7 to 3.7 meters thick. It was discovered by Sir Willie. And it's also attested to in other cities in not only Mesopotamia, but also in Elam, that's more to the east. So what archaeologists at first, they thought, how should we understand this flood level? Now, what is interesting, it divides an earlier period, which we call the Ubaid period. So in the material culture, if you do an archaeological dig throughout Mesopotamia, you'll find first the Ubaid period. So it's the same kind of culture that's found throughout the area. Then we find this flood layer and the flood. And after that, we find another period which is differentiated from the earlier period by a different material culture, which means the art and everything is different. It's a different culture. So this flood level divides Mesopotamia. So it's not just a local flood where a certain river has overflowed its banks or something like that, which happened later on, for example, in Kish or so. This is not what we're talking about here. So geologists are of the opinion that what happened is somehow the sea actually overran the land. It was not the rivers that actually caused the flood. Something happened and the sea overran the land. And this was a massive event. And it destroyed the civilization. And especially in southern Mesopotamia and also in Elam, we have very nice evidence. And what is nice here is we can historically date the moment when this flood took place. We will also later in the program discuss other places throughout the world and other evidence later on. But what is important in this stage is this flood level is important because in the Sumerian king list, this is how the flood is understood. Because we see that in the Sumerian king list, the earlier rulers before the flood were said to have ruled in Eridu. Now that's consistent with the Ubaid kind of culture. The other that ruled after the flood was associated with the city of Uruk, which corresponds with the Uruk period, which is after the deluge. So in the Sumerian king list, it's clearly this particular flood, which is archaeologically attested at Ur, as I've just said, and other cities, that are spoken of as understood as the great flood that the peoples of Mesopotamia spoke about, and the same history was delivered down, and we find that in all the related traditions in Mesopotamia. So these traditions actually go back to a very particular flood. This flood happened about 3,400, depends on the chronology you're using. I'm using the low chronology. In that chronology, it's about 3-4 BC. But in other chronologies, which make more use of the chronology, they'll even push it back towards until about 4,200 BC. But I don't agree with that. But anyhow, that's important because later on we'll compare other dates throughout the world, which also use chronology. And that's a nice relative date. So if we can, all of the dates that's in terms of chronology, we can compare them. And in that way, we can consider whether we can talk about a worldwide flood. But when it comes to an absolute date, this date has to be lowered, in my opinion. And the best date, according to the chronology that I'm using, and which has also been published, is about 3,400 BC.
Yes. So it's literally, you've got Eridu, and then there's a line, something happens, and then you go into Uruk. And
absolutely
that period.
Yeah.
So, and it's very, very distinct. So just according to the article that I read
Yeah.
as well. Okay, so Carel, did you? I sort of wanted to ask Carel, when you look at the dating, and then you look at the traditional Christian view, what does the traditional Christian view say about the dating of the flood? I'm putting you on the spot now.
Yeah, of course, there is a difference. The Masoretic text, which we use, places it later. And Willie, last time I think he mentioned the Septuagint, which helps us to get to a better date. Willie, maybe you can mention something of the Septuagint's date, if you'd like.
Yeah, so the Masoretic text, actually, that's the Hebrew text. Now, the Hebrew text we're talking about now, which is called the Masoretic text, is actually a relatively light text because it goes back to Yamnia, where a certain group of Jews in about the year 90 decided on this particular Jewish text. Now, what is interesting about the Septuagint, that word is derived from 70. And that refers to the 70 learned Jewish scholars that came together 2.5 centuries before the time of Christ, in about the 3rd century BC, so 250 BC in Egypt, and they translated the best Hebrew text of the time into a Greek, and that became known as the Septuagint. So what we find is the early church throughout used the Septuagint, and there are many references to the Septuagint and quotations from the Septuagint, not the Hebrew text, in the Bible. And there's a different discussion, so I don't want to go too deep into this, but the date in the Septuagint is 3300 BC. So we have two dates. We have one date, which goes back to a text from about 250 BC. That was when the Pentateuch was translated. So that is about 3300 BC. And then we have a later text, the Hebrew text. And in that text, the date is 2400 BC. So there's about 1,000 years difference between these two dates.
Yeah.
You can immediately see that the Septuagint date correlates very, very nicely with extra biblical evidence and the chronology for the ancient Middle East. The problem with the Masoretic text is that it's in direct conflict with everything we know about history. The period 2400 BC is very well understood. In Egypt, that was the time when they built the Great Pyramid. In Samaria, that was just before the Akkadian period. It was when the Sumerian civilization flourished. So both these, in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, 2400 BC, there is no sign of a flood at all. There's no flood there at that stage in history. We see two great civilizations powerfully in their prime during this period. There's no talk of flood at this stage. So the flood definitely happened much earlier, and we should accept the Septuagint date, as many other dates in the Septuagint, as we've been talking and as we will talk. We will see that it correlates, the Septuagint correlates amazingly well with what we know about history and a wider ancient Middle Eastern perspective. So sometimes Christians would just try to they would just say, okay, well, I'll stand with the Masoretic text. But the problem is just, it doesn't make sense. And we have to accept that this date is not correct.
Yeah, I think
I would like to add something.
Go ahead, Carel. Go ahead.
One of the big questions when we talk about the flood, William mentioned it was a worldwide flood. But was it worldwide in the sense of the whole world? Did it cover, for instance, also Mount Everest? Now, some people say this is completely impossible. So it has Noah's story has to be just a story and nothing more than that. So there seems to be these two extreme viewpoints. We must take the text literally as it is. It covered the whole world, and the others say, no, it is impossible, so it is just a story. Maybe you can say something on the worldwide stretch of the flood.
Yeah, so this is a question. On the one hand, one have scholars which are very critical of the biblical tradition. And they would say this is just a myth because we find it in many other traditions also a story about a flood. Or they will maybe allow for a local flood, maybe some river has overflown its banks or whatsoever. But this is definitely not how the ancient Mesopotamians understood the flood. I'm not talking about the later Jews. I'm talking about the Hebrews, I'm talking about the Akkadians, I'm talking about the Babylonians, I'm talking about the Sumerians. All of the people from Mesopotamia and the surrounding areas believed in a massive flood that nearly wiped out civilization and humankind. So the perspective is definitely from the ancient world, this was a major event. Now the question is, how do we determine how wide was the flood? Now, according to the Bible, the whole world was covered with water. But if you read the Bible, you'll see that's an observational statement. It's not a scientific statement. So throughout the Bible, especially in these early parts, often we find some observational statement. We find the whole world, for example, in the time of Joseph, we read that the whole world experienced a dramatic famine. It was great hunger throughout the world, and all the peoples came to Egypt from all over the world. The whole earth, that's the term used. Now, obviously, they didn't come from South America. That's quite clear. So the biblical author, when he talks about the whole earth, is not scientific statement, the whole earth. It's an observational statement. So if we read the scientific context in terms of today's understanding of things back into the Bible, we want the flood, if we try to understand it in these terms, then we would believe that the flood covered Mount Everest. But we know there's not enough waters. There's definitely not enough water on Earth to cover Mount Everest 8 kilometers above the sea level, current sea level. That's totally impossible. There's not enough water. So this over-literal way of understanding the flood cannot be correct. It's directly against science. It's also directly against a good reading of the text, because this is definitely not the way that one should read, for example, the story of the famine. The people did not come from South America. But this does not say it was just a local flood. So we do have evidence all over the world. For example, I visited Varna. It's a city in Bulgaria. And in Varna, that's on the Black Sea, just next to the Black Sea, they also experienced a massive flood in exactly the same period as the Sumerian flood. And there at that stage flourished a highly advanced civilization, which was totally destroyed by that particular flood. It's often called the Black Sea flood. It was exactly the same period. If we go further westwards, we find in the same period that at Clare, our little town of Clare in Great Britain, there was a short while ago, a few years ago, scientists discovered a small layer, a black layer of stuff. And the moment that it was exposed to the air, it dissipated. But when they analyzed it and studied it, they see it was a remnant, it was what leftovers, we can say, of a tsunami that overrun that area in about exactly the same time. Now, some people would even argue that this was actually the time when the British Channel, this land that's dividing Britain from from the European Union. Now, this area once was just, it was connected and people moved between these areas. And it's called Dogger Land. And this land mass were finally submerged in exactly about 4,200 BC. That's now the dendrochronological date. So in all these areas, we find something that's extremely interesting. We find signs of a flood. We find this massive tsunami in Ireland, clear in southeastern Ireland, dating about to this period. We know that Doggerland, this area between Britain and Europe, this land mass was covered by water finally during this period. I've already referred to the Black Sea flood. All of these and the Sumerian flood, it's in the same period. Dendrochronologically speaking, it's about 4,200 BC. And when we move to an absolute chronology, I would believe that we should lower it to 3,300 or 3,400 BC. So what we find is worldwide, there are clear signs of a massive flood. What is even more interesting is that before this dramatic event that hit the world, in Europe, there were a European-wide, a pan-European, as they call it, culture. It's called the LBK culture. That's what it's called, the LBK culture. And now what is interesting about this linear pottery culture is that during this exact period, this culture disappeared. So it's exactly the same that we found in Sumer. Before the flood, there was the Uruk, not the Uruk, the Ubaid culture. But we refer to the Ubaid culture. So in Europe, we had a different culture. It's called the LBK, the linear pottery culture. That was before these flood events. And suddenly, these people, these farmers, disappear throughout Europe. And their style, their building style, their long houses, the kind of stone tools they used, everything disappeared. They were somehow, this whole culture, those people spread throughout Europe, disappear, and new people appear afterwards. And how they related and connected are difficult things to explore and so forth. But all of this is good evidence to believe that there was a worldwide event, a massive event. Something happened, probably the axis of the earth tilted or something, causing massive floods in Sumer. The sea overran the land in the Black Sea area. That area was the whole civilization that was at that stage established next to the Black Sea was destroyed. The whole culture throughout Europe, this pan-European culture, this LBK farming, the farmers, all of these people, this culture disappeared. So clearly it's a worldwide thing. Now, the problem with flood layers is extremely difficult to find them in the archaeological terms. It's not easy to find them because a flood happened, people moved the ground, they built on top of their houses. And so it's not easy to find evidence of a flood. But when we compare all this evidence, I think we have good reason to believe in a worldwide flood. So I do not believe that the waters covered the earth and Mount Everest was also covered with water. That's scientifically impossible. That's not what the Bible says in my way of thinking. But that it was a massive event and that the Bible is definitely in line with what we find in the rest of the ancient Middle Eastern tradition, there can be no doubt it was a massive event. And the story about Noah is also not only in the Bible. We find very similar stories in the other traditions. So I think we can say with very good reason that when considering the evidence, we can believe it was a worldwide flood if we qualify it in certain terms, and we can believe the biblical story.
So Willie, my next question would be, after the flood, the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. So there's obviously a difference between where the ark actually ended up according to popular culture and what happened on the Sumerian side, if you look at the Sumerian context. Can you say a bit more about that and where we suspect the error might have come in with the current viewpoint?
Yeah, so Ararat, the mountain of Ararat is presently in Turkey. The Turks has taken it from the Armenians. The Armenians is not happy. I actually visited Armenia and went to the area very close to the mountain. You have a very beautiful view. And the Armenians to this day, that was a massive loss because Mount Ararat they were the first nation to become Christian. And Mount Ararat is central to their way of thinking, seeing themselves in terms of history. So now let's consider Mount Ararat. It's a beautiful mountain. It's quite high up. It's just south of the Black Sea, but it's very far removed from the ancient Middle East. So if this is true, then the story of the flood would have carried the ark enormous distance. So let's consider the name Ararat. Now, what is interesting is we find that the name Ararat actually goes back to Urartu. It's a very similar name, but that's the earlier and the older name. So when the Bible refers to Ararat in the north, remember the north is from Mesopotamia, from Sumer, the land from which the biblical author orientates himself towards the north. Then he's clearly referring in the time of writing to Urartu. Now, the Urartu civilization flourished towards the north of the Zagros Mountains. It was in the northern parts, far northern parts of nowadays of Iran, northwestern Iran. I've also visited that part of the world. Now, what is interesting, from the south, you travel through 7 mountain ranges, and then you arrived at a land that was, before it was called Ararat. It was called, and before it was called Urartu, it was called Arata. Very similar, but that's the old name. So in ancient Sumer, in the stories of the ancient kings of Uruk, this northern country was called Arata. And we read in the stories how the king's messenger traveled through these 7 mountain ranges and reached the land of Arata. And later on, King Sargon, the Assyrian king, also on one of his campaigns tells how he traveled through the 7 mountain ranges and how he came to the river of Arata. That's the only reference outside the traditional material in historical data referring to the Arata River. So this was in the north. But it was not where we find the mountain of Ararat. So what happened is, through time, the people living in these northern parts, which is today the northwestern parts of Iran, the northern parts of the Zagros Mountains, they were pushed further and further north by invaders and all sorts of other people, and they moved slowly but steadily. At a certain stage, the Armenians were established in Lake Van, Lake Urmia, that whole area. Later on, they moved even further back. The Turks actually pushed them out. And eventually, they landed up in Armenia. And their name is also derived from Urartu. And they, in their culture, they gave this mountain this name, not only because of their ancient traditions regarding this name, but also in terms of biblical tradition. So this is not where the ark landed up. The ark landed up within the Zagros Mountains, and that is far from the southern parts of Sumer, where the story of the Bible places Noah and these people. But it's quite some distance from there, but it's not so far as if we move to Mount Ararat in the north. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So that's a background story.
There you go. Carel, anything from your side?
It is just amazing listening to Willie, who has been there, how the archaeology also helps us, to understand the flood better, the location of the flood, the size of the flood, and something else. Many people also, try to find evidence of the flood in various places of the world. But it seems that to date the flood, that is the very important proof, so that we can be sure this was actually the flood the Bible speaks about. So archaeology is really important when we consider the flood of Noah.
Carel, that's an extremely important point, because we have cataclysmic events throughout the world. And if we believe, and this is the problem, if you believe the earth is 6,000 or about that years old, then what these readers do, they take all evidence about all possible similar kind of events all over the world, and immediately they interpret it in terms of the biblical flood. So in a certain sense, they can't be wrong, because this is the only possible event where everything could fit into a story, 6,000, starting about 6, or maybe perhaps I would go slightly earlier, starting from 17,000 years ago. But if we use archaeological data and we date all of these different flood layers and cataclysmic events throughout the world and the earth, some are very old. Some goes back thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So I believe the earth is very old. And it's not enough to say, but okay, we have evidence for the flood on this or that level. We must use good archaeological evidence. We must date the flood in a certain way. We must have a manner to decide what is the period, in what period does this flood layer fit into. And it's not good enough just to use any evidence and just believe it's related to the flood. Because in my view, I believing in an old earth and believing it's consistent with the Bible, as we've already spoken, we've discussed Genesis 1, and so it's very consistent with an old age of the earth and so forth. So once we see it in those terms, it's not good enough just to say, here is some kind of cataclysmic event that has happened. It's not good enough. You have to date it. There must be good evidence to secure the particular date that this event happened. And once we not just take any evidence all over the world that relates to a flood and believe it's a big flood, this is the delusion the Bible is talking about. This is usually done. This is not the right way. We must secure it through good evidence on the ground. And this is what I've done regarding the flood layer, not only in Sumer, but also at the Black Sea, in Ireland, and in the rest of Europe. So this is why I'm saying there was a worldwide massive event and deluge accompanying it during that particular period.
So Willie, if we date the flood within the Sumerian context, is there any evidence of a Noah in that specific period and his family? And then do we have anything that pops up in the Sumerian king list that relates to that as well? I think that'll sort of strengthen the whole case as well.
Yeah, so what we find is in Sumerian tradition, we have a person called Suider, who was the last antediluvian king in Sumer. That's the one living before the flood. And also in Akkadian tradition, he is called Atrahasis. That's just other names for Noah, the biblical Noah. And so there are various traditions about this particular person that built a large boat, and very similar to some extent with the biblical story. But I believe the Bible, the biblical author, did not borrow from the Babylonians. I did not believe that. I believe what we have is parallel traditions. So there was a Semitic tradition in which the story was handed down, connected to the forefathers of Abraham. And it was in those circles that this story was handed down about this real flood that happened. And this is the one we find in the Bible. From that very same event, other traditions developed, telling the very same story, maybe in other terms or other details and so forth. But the stories are similar enough to believe they go back to the same original event. But they're too different to believe that the Hebrew story was borrowed from the other story, from even the Sumerian story. So there's a large enough difference between the stories to believe that the biblical story stands on its own feet. It was handed down in its own terms as a tradition, and a believable tradition, and that's why we believe in the story. But in other traditions, as I've mentioned, we also have reference to this very same Noah person. Yes.
And then if we can just sort of slightly touch on Meshkiach Kasher, would you be able to just sort of place him in?
Yeah, so this is also a way to just date the flood. So let's have a look at the biblical story. So in the Bible, we read about the flood. And then after the flood, we read that Noah and his sons populated the world. And we read about Kish, Am and his son Kish. And Kish, he had a son called Nimrod. And Nimrod is very well known, about the Tower of Babel. And I believe somewhere in the near future, we'll, as Lord willing, be talking about the Tower of Babel also. But what is interesting is that this family of Kish corresponds closely with a similar family in Sumerian tradition, also ruling after the flood in Sumer. According to the Bible, Nimrod ruled in Uruk. Now, Uruk, remember, the period we're talking about referred to the period after the flood. It's called the Uruk period. Uruk was the main city. And in the biblical tradition, this is exactly where Nimrod ruled. Nimrod belonged to the family of Cush. And we'll go into much more detail at a later stage when we talk about the Nephilim and these kind of interesting things. But Kish corresponds with a person called Meshkiach Kasher. So Kash is a shortened form of Meshkiach Kasher, and Kash corresponds with Kesh in the Bible, Cush in the Bible. And we're talking about the very same family. In both instances, we find, according to the tradition in Sumer, that this family originated from the land of Ararat in the north.
Quite nicely.
Meshkiach Kasher's son is called in Merkar, and he was a great builder king, and he ruled in Uruk. And according to the stories about him, he was born and raised in the land of Ararat. In the biblical story, Noah, they ended up on Ararat. They came from the north and settled. This family of Cush came and settled in Sumer. And his son was Nimrod. And what is interesting, if you compare the names, they're not only very similar figures ruling, because in both instances, we read that they were powerful rulers using military power to extend their empire, if you can call it an empire, or their kingdom. And even their names are very similar. We must remember that every name has what we would call a root, the root of the name. The consonants in the name forms the root. The vowels change with time, all the time.
So it would be NMR.
Absolutely. So when we look at in Merkar, it's NMR and then Kar. And if we look at Nimrod, it's NMR with a D end. So it's been argued by other scholars that this is exactly the same person and the same traditions, one in Sumer and the other in biblical tradition, and this is strong evidence. There's such a lot of evidence and agreement between these two families, both of them appearing in Sumer. The Bible calls it Sinar, the land of Sinar. It corresponds with Sumer, both ruling in Uruk, and we'll come back to them and we'll talk about them, but they appear on the scene after the deluge. And when we take the Sumerian tradition and the king list, Sumerian king list, we see that they belong to what we call the Uruk period. And before this period was the Great Deluge, and before that, the Ubaid period. So we can securely date this Sumerian flood, and it corresponds remarkably with the biblical tradition. So we can believe the biblical story, not only on its own terms, but because of the massive supporting evidence that we can gather regarding it.
It's a beautiful thing. It's like little puzzle pieces that just keep snapping together.
Yeah.
Carel, just from a biblical point of view, why did the flood take place? And the other thing is, was God very cruel to kill off everybody? Can you sort of expand on that?
I was just thinking, the way it's interesting. I was writing here the reason for the flood, and now you ask me the question.
I'm a great mind reader.
Yeah, somehow, eh? Yes, if we read in Genesis, I think chapter 5 or 6, we read God's heart was really broken because the man he created were just doing evil, were pondering only on evil deeds, violent deeds, from his young childhood years until he dies. So God was really saddened by the immense evil which were present on earth, and probably mentioning the Nephilim, the giants and the fallen angels, had an influence also in teaching man, how to practice occultic things and so on. But it seemed that the earth was a very dangerous place at that time. People were very violent, and it seemed that God decided in his heart to cleanse the earth and to make a new start. And then, the character of Noah is so interesting. He built the ark. I think it was almost 100 years it took him. But that was such a powerful sermon warning the people of a flood or a big deluge coming. Being mocked by the people, maybe they thought he's crazy, but somewhere in the New Testament, it's mentioned that Noah was, I think, an evangelist. He was preaching to the people, trying to warn them. But nobody seemed to pay attention until it all happened. And, even in the day we live, where we do experience that our culture is moving away from biblical principles, becoming more godless, becoming more human-centered, we find ourselves almost in a similar kind of situation, that when we warn people that you will have to verantwoording doen, what is that?
Take responsibility. And you're sort of also referring to the line that says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man.
We will have to give an account of our lives before our Maker. People doesn't seem to like that kind of message. But we do find ourselves in a similar situation with a culture moving away from God. And, various things are happening, and we can see it as harsh, but we can also see it as God calling the world back to himself. Yeah, so I think the Ark of Noah has got a very strong message for the world and for the Christians of our day.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important that we're knowledgeable and educated with regard to that. There's two other things that I just wanted to. We probably don't want to go into too much detail around that. Just for interest's sake, Willie, if you look at the generations since Noah, how many generations up until today would you be able to?
Okay, I'm not generationally speaking, I'm not sure, but I would like to say something. Just go back to Noah and his sons. So we read that Noah and his sons and their wives were in the ark with the animals. And what is interesting, if we take the descendants, so you're not really talking about the descendants of Noah and his three sons, the Hamites, which is usually interpreted as the people of Africa, African people, people with black skin, is descended from Ham, according to the Bible, closely related to the family we've just been talking about, because Ham was also the father of Cush. And then we have Japheth, and we have Sem. So the Semites, the Japhetites are usually associated with the people in Europe, so those kind of people. But what is interesting, the people that's not mentioned, and that's definitely not descended from Noah, are the Chinese, are the Indians in America, are the Bushmen. So there are many peoples. So this is, remember, this is a very generalized picture that's given in this genealogies in the Bible. But it's very clear that the whole world and everybody that we know are on this earth was definitely not descended from Moses, from Noah. So this is just another clear message that the Bible is not telling us that everybody died. This is definitely not what the Bible is saying. But the Bible is saying it was a massive event. And the Bible places this event in terms and discuss this event in terms of God's overall plan for man. And what Carel has, I think, explored very nicely and stated quite clearly is that God has a plan, but God is righteous and God judges sin. And there's something that we don't hear often in our day. We hear often God is love, and God is love. But in this instance, God punished sin, and he allowed this event upon the world. Many people were killed. And what the Bible says, in the end of days, we will find the same rebellious generation. People that will be rebellious against God, against God's law, against God's moral law. And we're moving towards that quite fast, because there are a great rebellious spirit throughout the world against God. And if you read Revelation, we find that terrible things will happen according to the Bible. And this will be God's judgment. Because at the end of the day, God judges every single person. And the question is, I think we should also consider this, our standing with God, whether we are forgiven, whether we belong to him as one of his children. Because in an age like this, that's moving away from God and it's rebellious against God. That's actually, we find in the New Testament that the flood is used as an example of what God has done in the past and what we will do again in future.
Yes, beautiful. I think that's the perfect way to basically stop the podcast. I just wanted to really thank you guys. This has been really, really interesting, and I think we did answer a lot of questions that people might have. We will be posting this on the Bible GPS page as well as the Core Ideas page, and with all of the links. And I actually have already posted the article that you wrote to, Willie. And again,
I think that readers should also go, listeners should also go and read the article for themselves and ponder it a little bit, because this is important things, and so you should consider all the facts on the table.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. And if there's any other questions, you guys have the links, just notify us. Thank you very much. Thanks, Carel. Thanks, Willie.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.